and you read about this in the press all the time, actually, which shows this is an issue, is this concern that the Chinese, what I was saying earlier, they weren't really anywhere in 3G or 4G, but there's this perception now, perhaps because they talk about things like polar codes a lot, and some of the other underpinning technologies in 5G, that they control the 5G standard.
Yeah.
This is clearly what they're trying to do when they put out these bits of research saying we own most of the patents and we're the guys who developed this. Does the West need to worry if the big players in mobile standards development, when that standard is a global one, are Chinese, and they can shape it in a way that suits them, and they can make money from device sales that might be, equipment manufactured by Western companies?
Hello and welcome to another Telecoms.com podcast. We were going to have guests this week, but they're not well. So it's just me and Ian. It was almost going to not be me and Ian because he's having tech support grief at the moment, which means he can't get into his computer. But rather than sit
Computer
there...
says no, Scott.
Computer says no.
Quite literally.
He says no to Ian.
I'm afraid I can't, Ian.
It's sick of... His computer's censoring him. He's writing too much tasty journalism and his computer's not having it.
You know I can't do that, Ian.
Yeah, exactly. I wouldn't write that if I were you, Ian. But you're here anyway. Nice one, mate. And then after this, and I should announce, on the booze side, last week we had Charlie here and he brought a bunch of savage beer and we drank the lowest alcohol ones, which were about 5%, which is still going some. You do an evening on 5%, you fucking know about it.
Yeah.
And I made the executive decision because I got here a bit early with some ice to pick which ones I was going to chill. And I decided we've got to get through some of these more weapons grade ones sooner or later. We just got to sip them a bit more slowly. So I'm going with one of Charlie's, which is Dale's American Pale Ale, which is a mere 6.5%. And Ian and Pierre have decided to go in some of the ones from Mary Clark's family brewery, the ones that we were too scared to have before that are 8%.
That's not quite weapons grade 6.5.
Nah, that's borderline. You're on weapons. You're on 8%.
That's a gamma ray level beer. This is getting up to Belgian levels.
Getting up to Tramp Brew levels. And then we got some more. So we'll see how it goes, but we're going to try and sip it.
Yeah, I'm not very good at sipping beer, though.
Well, quite.
Sipping something you do with port.
Adjust our habits. Well, imagine it's a tin of port. So that's that, and we've started late, partly because of Ian's tech support issues. So I'm going to try and inject a tiny bit more time discipline than we normally do on this one. Oh, and happy birthday, Pierre!
Happy birthday!
I know Pierre came in on his birthday, and he's got a new sweatshirt that says "parfait," which means perfect. And who are we to argue with that?
We should be setting off party poppers, really, and firing champagne around the room and stuff like that.
We should. God. Pierre, it just occurs to me, I don't know why it never occurred to me before. Have you ever heard of a comedian called Andrew Lawrence?
No.
I'll send you a picture. You look a bit like him. Something it's just grabbed me now, maybe because your beard's a bit longer than usual.
Lawrence.
It's not a significant birthday, is it?
No. Can we ask how old you are?
Are you 30?
He's got creepy eyes.
Yeah, but in terms of the colour of hair and shape of face and all that sort of thing.
Yeah.
But he's got slightly more great white shark eyes.
I'm going to guess you're 33, 34, 33.
No. I'm older. I'm older than Jesus. Yeah.
35. Are you going to tell us?
Yeah, 37. Yeah.
37? Oh my God.
Now.
He's
aged well.
Gone?
Well, he's getting a few little smile lines around his eyes there. It's got to be said.
Yeah, if I want to be 30 again, I just shave.
Yeah.
That's a good point. Yeah.
I don't have that option.
Anyway, happy birthday, Pierre. Hope you have a good one later. Thanks for coming in on your birthday.
Guys.
Cheers.
Right, let's crack on. We are... Okay, the running order is good. We're going to talk about 6G because, as I will just ask Ian to open talking about, there was a dinner with Interdigital, who we've had Interdigital on the pod before. Mm-hmm. They're basically very much involved in the R&D side of, especially the radio side of things. Although they probably do all kinds of shit other than that. Sorry, Interdigital.
Well, they are pure research.
They are pure research, but they probably do much more than just radio.
In some other areas,
right?
Like some TV compression stuff as well.
That's
I think,
it. Yeah, codecs and all that.
I think those are the two main things.
Okay,
wireless
all right.
Tech and
fair enough. And I was going to go, but the fucking trains were on strike.
Yeah, well, I had that problem as well, but fortunately, I live a lot closer than
you. No, they were. I mean, I would have gone today. I had to literally run for the train because there was about one an hour rather than one every 15 minutes.
Yeah.
But on that day, there was just nothing. There was zero. So it just wasn't. It wasn't. So sorry about that, Interdigital. But we're going to chat about it anyway. You're going to get the PR win anyway, so it's all good.
Yeah.
So I'll hand over to you in a sec on that, and then you've written a couple of pieces following on from that, and then you've also, both of us have written a bit about the chip market from different perspectives. So the second bit we're going to talk about that, and third bit I've got a couple of bits that are quite Scott Pacino self-indulgent, like more to do with things like, power and freedom and the kind of issues that float my boat. But as ever, there's a sort of tenuous telecoms justification. I was just saying to a colleague, actually, before we started, that I'm very lucky in my job because there can't be many other journalists that can just sit down one day and just go, fuck it, I'm going to write about this. And I don't have to run it past anyone. I never get bollocked for writing stuff that's only tenuously linked to telecoms. So I'm very grateful for that. So hurrah. And so, we'll dig into one or two of those at the end. Right, Ian, why don't you start by telling us, tell us about your dinner, what was chatted about, and how that leads into what you wrote.
So it was a dinner organised by our friends at CC Group.
Mm-hmm.
So to give them a shout out. And Paul Nolan, in particular, I think and Chloe, they were the main organisers of it. So quite a small number of people. I think someone else dropped out as well because of the trains.
Right.
But there's a couple of analysts there, a couple of people that we know on the sort of trade journalism side.
Keith was there, yeah?
Keith was there. Harry from Total Telecom.
Right.
If either of them are listening to this.
I wonder if they do. They never tell us if they do.
No, I don't know. I don't know if you do, because you get quite busy, don't you, with your stuff. I think other journalists tend probably not to listen to telecom podcasts anyway. But
from when I've socialised with Keith, I can imagine he'd have a certain upper limit of listening to my
I don't think he
shit
likes
that
podcasts
comes out of my mouth.
From speaking to Keith. I don't want to put words into his mouth, but I get the feeling he doesn't particularly he's not a sort of podcast person anyway.
Podcast kind of
much
guy.
more into sort of reading stuff than that.
Actual reading.
Yeah.
Do you know, I was reflecting on that, how I'm pretty sure that even since I was like my kid's age, my attention spans diminished thanks to computers and phones and stuff. I can research a story, I can go down a rabbit hole on a story and give something my full attention for an hour or two, but I don't really read books anymore.
Yeah.
I'll get through a few articles on Spectator in and out on a Friday today. In fact, there's some come to that, some interesting tangents on that to do with freedom. They've led with various types of smoking ban that are coming in the UK. And
I've got it in my bag, but I didn't read it on the train because
let's see.
I was frustrated.
You're too busy shaking your fist at your laptop. Anyway, sorry, tangent there. But
so the main executive there is a guy called Alan Morad. Who's he's sort of head of their sort of European lab, I think, basically. And a colleague of his called Sebastian, I think. Right. I can't remember his surname, but it was like a pretty unpronounceable surname that I'd mangle if I tried to say it anyway. So
Van something?
No, he's not. I'm pretty sure Sebastian's not French. So
I would imagine any surname that's preceded by Sebastian's going to be hard to pronounce.
Yeah, but
although there's a bit of history of English Sebastians, posh people.
I met Alan before. If you remember, they did a dinner a few years ago.
Right.
When they had a couple of other senior executives there who I'm not sure are still with the company anymore.
Okay.
The guy who was head of comms.
Yeah, like that South African guy, I don't think so anymore.
Yeah, he's not there anymore.
I don't think so. Sorry if you are.
He's not there. No, he's not there.
Oh, right,
he's not,
right.
Because we chatted about it. He's moved on, but he was quite entertaining.
Yeah, he's good fun.
Yeah. I think he's just moved on jobs-wise.
Yeah.
I think that's all it is. But
there's no drama.
But Alan basically, Alain, I suppose you should try and pronounce it. Yeah.
Pierre approves.
He did the sort of main presentation. I mean, it was obviously going to be a presentation. They want to sort of get their pitch across, I guess, in advance of MWC. And I mean, just to sort of where Interdigital come into mobile is, as I say, they're purely research. So they're a bit like a very small bit of what Ericsson, Nokia, and Huawei would do, in that they kind of get involved in the research that goes into these mobile phone standards that come out every few years, but they don't take it through to development and product.
Yeah, and in business model, you could compare them to the IP bit of Nokia.
Totally, except the IP bit of Nokia is pure profit because all the development costs are in other divisions, but you still obviously need to pay for research.
And a lot of it, I mean, the whole reason it was set up is when Nokia... I remember because I was covering this at the time. Nokia, back when it was still a leader in terms of handsets and that sort of thing, it split itself in four. It had the bit that we know now, which is the networks bit, which was for a while was Nokia Siemens Networks, until they bought out Siemens from the JV.
Yeah.
It was the devices bit, which ended up just getting sold to Microsoft, and then Microsoft wrote off the whole value of that acquisition.
Yeah.
It's amazing, actually. If you look at the history of Nokia handset division, how it went from dominant to zero in less than a decade. It's remarkable. That was when I was a smartphone analyst. I was tracking that. It's fucking amazingly how quickly it went off a cliff. Obviously, directly in coincidence with iPhone and Android.
Yeah.
And then it had the IP bit, which is all this legacy intellectual property. You know, I mean, Nokia used to spend. I remember looking at charts. Nokia used to spend like 5 times more than Apple on R&D a year. So, so they've spent tons on R&D on all sorts of bits and bobs like cameras and all the other little arcana that makes things work. So they've got all that and they're still monetizing that. And then their fourth bit was a navigation bit. They spent a ton of money on a company I think called Navtech.
Yeah.
And then they ended up flogging that, and it became Here, that's owned by a bunch of German car companies.
Yeah.
But basically, so what happened was that of those 4 bits it split into, the only 2 bits that are left is the networks bit, which is the most of it, and the IP bit.
It is, although there's kind of 4 divisions now. There's mobile network infrastructure, which is, as you said last week, is kind of fixed.
Yeah.
And then there's the cloud software.
You're letting me have that one now, are you?
There's the cloud. Well, it is really, I suppose. Yeah, the cloud, to simplify it completely. And there's the cloud software stuff, and then there's Nokia Technologies. But the margins are, I mean, it's accounting really is what does it. It's not pure profit. It's just that they account for all the research and development that they do, which is substantial, by the way. It's still about 4 billion a year.
Right.
They spend in other divisions, yeah. So, whereas a pure research company can't do that. It has to account for the research.
Yeah, but unlike Ericsson, which does an equivalent amount of R&D, Ericsson doesn't have an IP licensing.
Oh, it does.
division.
Yeah, it does.
Oh, it
now,
does?
I think. Yeah.
Oh, shit.
Well, it might not.
Shows what I know.
I don't know. It might not, but I thought it did. It certainly has a bit that sells, that does sort of license things. They get into disputes with Samsung and Apple in the same way, and they make money that way.
No, that's a good point.
So they still monetize their intellectual property. They might not make quite.
They just don't have a separate accounting chunk.
I don't think they do the brand licensing that Nokia does.
No, with HMD Global.
Yeah, but I think the brand licensing probably hasn't really gone anywhere. I think most of the money's probably coming from actually tech licensing. So let's remember, by the way, that Ericsson, you were saying like they used to spend a load of shit on R&D more than Apple did, which clearly isn't the case anymore, but by a long way. And and its legacy, but they still are big spenders. I mean, those are well, this is one thing that came out of the dinner actually that was quite interesting, and we've talked about this before, I'm sure. Like the top people when it comes to the owners of patents in the mobile standards would include Ericsson and Nokia.
Yeah.
Along with Huawei, there's always this big discussion going on about who's on the top.
Well, Huawei
used to be anywhere.
Well, and Huawei used to. I haven't seen any press releases from them in a while, but a few years ago, you used to get these press releases saying that they're kicking ass on patents.
Yeah,
and then you'd always get a bit of counter briefing from people I won't mention. But people can imagine, people with a vested interest in the topic, going, yeah, but most of those patents are bullshit. Like they're not standards essential or something like that.
Yeah, I mean, I don't think all of it's bullshit.
No, I'm just talking about the counter briefing.
I know one of the counter briefings, it's not even a counter briefing, it's just someone coming out with his honest independent opinion, would be Richard Windsor, who thinks that Huawei that it's overemphasized the importance they play in standard essential patents. And essentially his argument is that there are standard essential patents and then there are more standard essential patents. And like the stuff you use this analogy of a plane. Like you need loads of things to make a plane work, and you need seats in it and you need trays, but they're obviously
you really need wings and engines.
As the wings and the engines. And I think one of the argument that I found really compelling for him was a lot of 5G technology is actually built on top of 4G, like OFDM stuff is still the underpinning sort of waveform technologies and things like that, and air interface stuff is. It's kind of it's based on what was done in 4G, and yet Huawei's position in 3G and 4G was not very big really in comparison. It suddenly sort of came along with 5G and claimed to be on top of the pile.
Yeah.
And that's the reason he's a bit sort of dubious about it.
And it always has a slight.
I kind of go along with that to some extent.
It always has a slight pissing competition element to it, because you're like, well, okay, even if you are, so fucking what?
Yeah, totally. But anyway, InterDigital, to go back to them, would fit into this group of companies that own patents. that go into the mobile standards. Now, they wouldn't, by their own admission, they're not up there with Huawei or Ericsson or Nokia or the big owners, but they're certainly quite high up. I think what tends to happen if you look at those tables is the very big sort of 4 or 5, 6 at the top perhaps own quite large percentages, and then you go further down and it tapers off quite quickly. And InterDigital would have, I'm guessing, a kind of low single-digit percentage. They claim to have a low single-digit percentage, I think, of the SEPs that are going into things like 4G and 5G. You probably looked up a table now.
Well, yeah, I mean, I've just done
absolute bullshit.
No, but I mean, it's just Googling, and you've always got to wonder about the sources. So this is a website I've never heard of before called IAM Trade Secrets. It's quite a cool name.
Right.
And then they've got a table 1, ranking of the top 10, and my Google search was 5G SEP owners, standard essential patents. And so their table says ranking of the top 10 5G patent family owners. I don't know what I mean. It's got Huawei One, Qualcomm, Samsung,
this is the problem
Ericsson,
in itself
Nokia.
Because there's all these different ways of categorizing it. You have
InterDigital 10th.
contributions, you have SEPs, you just have overall patents, you have families.
Yeah.
You know, this is one of the problems. There's not a very standardized way of actually reporting on this stuff anyway.
Totally, I completely concede that.
But yeah, anyway, that's where InterDigital kind of comes into it. They're a much smaller, clearly, but they would claim to have some critical stuff. And how do they make their money? Well, they make their money from phone sales mainly. You know, it's like when phones are sold, a little bit of
and they
money
get like
goes to
2p of every
patent
phone.
owners. Yeah, exactly. It's that sort of thing. So they're one of the people that does that. And by the way, it's all supposed to be done, but you do get these arbitration and legal disputes. It's all supposed to be done on what's called FRAND, that's it. So fair, reasonable, and non-discriminatory licensing principles, which is essentially about
such a murky, arcane world.
Not kind of holding people's feet over the fire when it comes to
I think the spirit is to try and avoid patent arms races.
Yeah.
Which still happen. I remember a little while back. You remember? I mean, you probably remember them better than me. You remember Nortel?
Yeah.
And then they went bust because they fucked everything up in some way that I can't quite remember.
Well, some of it's blamed on Huawei, actually.
Right, okay.
Disaster. I mean, let's remember that a lot of those guys don't exist anymore.
Yeah.
The guys that used to do base
But what happened with people like Nortel, and there will have been others, is they had a bit of a fire sale, and you had random people buying a whole chunk of their patents, just like in bulk.
Yeah.
They almost didn't give a fuck what they were, just so that they could protect themselves from vexatious patent claims from other people. So you get this arms race where, let's say Ericsson goes, you owe us some money because you're using this technology for talking to people that we invented. And then you can go, if you've bought a bunch of these other random patents that you don't really give a toss about, you can go, okay, or we could call it quits, and then we won't enforce these other things.
Yeah.
So you get quite a lot of that, and that's what FRAND is supposed to try and head off, is this really adversarial patent hoarding, I think.
Yeah.
That's one of the reasons for it, anyway.
Totally. So that's how InterDigital makes its money, and they've been disparaged in the past. I think maybe there was some truth in it in the past. I don't know, but I think it's unfair today, sort of having had something to do with them and seeing what they talk about as patent trolls. People that just own patents for the sake of making money. They actually do spend a lot of money on research and development.
Yeah.
They're very involved in actually trying to move this stuff on and explore what it can do and innovate in their own right. And then obviously it's other people that take it through to fruition.
I agree with that. And I think a patent troll tends to be a totally opportunistic company.
Be more like a company that just goes around snapping stuff up and make a lot of money out of it, basically. So I think that's kind of unfair. And what Alan really wanted to talk about at this dinner was with 6G. And what's happening there? What they're involved in on the 6G side of things, and how 6G is shaping up. We went to an event last year, I remember, at the University of Surrey, and some of
I can see he's doing it again. He hasn't invited us this time. Maybe we fucked it up for him.
But I think it was becoming a little bit clearer then, maybe what some of the things might be in the 6G standard.
It's still quite vague though, wasn't it?
Well, it's not so vague now.
Right,
the interesting thing. It is not very vague.
Enlighten
anymore.
us.
So there was a big meeting apparently, which I was completely unaware of, last year in Taiwan that 3GPP had in sort of June time, where it was a workshop essentially when they kind of decide on things to prioritize, and you get the industry, kind of all the important people in the industry and groups like Etsy and all this sort of stuff feeding into this workshop, and three things came out of it, as far as Alan was saying. Three sort of things that they decided were big differentiators between 6G and 5G.
Right.
So I wrote two stories this week.
One, you can
and
make
this
some
was
money out of it.
on a kind of technical service side, and maybe you can make some money out of it. But one of them was something called RIS, which is reconfigurable intelligent surfaces, I think.
Oh,
yeah. So this is kind of what one of my pieces basically did that about it.
I think I've got your two. So I got one piece up from you that says 6G, unlike recent Gs, might actually excite consumers.
Yeah.
Is that the one you're referring to?
Yeah. So
and then you got another one that refers to Huawei in the 6G context.
Yeah, so the one the common one, which is the 6G might actually excite consumers, is very much picking up on this idea of there being three things. There's one called RAS. There's another one called another one's very much about the spectrum that gets used. So there's this batch of spectrum sort of between 7 gigahertz and 15 gigahertz now that they're looking at that could be used for deployment of 6G technologies. If you remember 5G, one of the things about 5G was using millimeter wave spectrum, which is even higher than that, and didn't really seem to go anymore. Yeah, and so this is bringing it down a bit, but it's still kind of quite a bit higher than what we used to build out 3G and 4G with. And then the other one, which I think is the most interesting, which is kind of the point of that story, is sensing. And if you remember, there's quite a lot of talk about that last year.
That's the one I've heard the most associated with 6G.
And the premise of my piece that I wrote this morning on a crap computer that I just about managed to get away with is that...
You wouldn't guess looking at it, mate.
Is that the sensing stuff... Now, I'm not saying it definitely will, because some people might, even with sensing, go, oh, what the hell? Why is that important? But I think that the sensing side of 6G actually has the potential to make 6G different in a way that the previous two standards haven't been. So if you look at, operators like to market the Gs, don't they?
Yes.
Even though I think they're not worth marketing to consumers.
Not anymore.
And I don't...
4G meant something. 5G doesn't mean much to consumers.
I don't think 4G means anything either. I think there's only been... If you look at it from a consumer perspective, my view is there's only 2 Gs. Mm-hmm. There's one which came around about the time that when Michael Douglas was walking around on a beach talking on a brick-sized device rather than being in an office or home
Wall Street.
On a landline phone. Yeah, and there's another one where you put the internet on that.
Okay, and so
device.
The only reason I flag up forward, and I think we can agree on this, is that for those first two generations, the odd one was where they introduced the technology, and the even one is where they did it properly, and that's why I think 4G did mean something to consumers, because it was mobile broadband done properly.
Yes, but just doing it properly doesn't mean it's as I say, if you were going to,
it's still evolutionary rather than revolutionary. Yeah, I'll give you
two
that.
developments. One is a mobile phone.
One is voice, the other's data,
and the other one's the internet on a mobile phone.
Yeah,
1G to 2G. Was going from analog to digital. Well, a consumer doesn't care about going from analog to digital.
Can I ring my mate up
it works just
and find out which pub they're at?
So the only Gs really that I think were actually really big breakthroughs, forgetting about all the let's fix the problems in the last one and actually make it work properly, are 1G and 3G.
Okay, I'll concede that.
2G, 4G and 5. 2G was going from analog to digital. 4G was 3G done properly, if you like. And 5G was 4G a bit better, plus some network plumbing overhaul like cloud native.
Yeah, but nothing to excite
nobody is ever going to care about. Yeah. And yet we still get operators with... I looked this up actually for the story, like billboards to do with 5G, just to see that I wasn't talking crap. And all the stuff that came out when they launched 5G a few years ago, you had all these... the best 5G network in London, and you can get 5G on the phone on the London Underground now. And yet, even now, if you ask someone like my dad what 5G is, he'd probably struggle to explain it to you other than saying, isn't it a bit better than 4G? Well, but that's not a generational change. No one ever said the big differences between millennials and Generation X is that millennials can run a bit faster at any given moment in time than Generation X because they're younger. When sociologists look at the big differences between generations of people, those aren't the things they call out. So to call them generational changes, I think is a really stupid thing to do.
Yeah. But so we've got voice and data,
mobile.
And so we're looking for the new paradigm.
Even I don't like the actual data. I don't like that word. Actually, internet services. Yeah. Like no consumer is going to go, it's data on the phone. They're going to go, I can use the internet on my phone.
No, fair enough. Yeah. But for the purpose of you and I, who are relatively enlightened compared to the average punter on this, we can call it voice and data. I mean, you couldn't do data over 2G networks, could you?
Well, I think you could send
text messages.
And you could actually do some basic stuff on things like Edge. But
you had WAP.
WAP, yeah, exactly.
Which is not to be confused with that Cardi B song. Was it Cardi B? And some American...
but doing it in a way that actually works, let's say 3G.
WAP stood for something really obscene when she came out of that song.
I mean, it worked properly when we got to later 3G stuff, yeah? HSPA and everything. That's when you could actually start using the internet on your phone.
Yeah, you could actually load up a website in a
and
tolerable...
4G just improved on it, basically. So I
So,
think
so what I'm leading up to is there a new paradigm?
this is what I'm saying, why 6G could actually be 3G, is that you have all of a sudden, this isn't just me sort of coming up with this. I mean, there was some talk about this at the dinner with the guy, Sebastian, saying this is actually something you can explain to consumers in a way that you can't explain 5G. If you sit down, if a kind of industry person sits down and tries to explain 5G to an average consumer, they either go, oh, it's a bit better, which they don't want to say, or they say things like, well, it's cloud native, therefore you can build a distributed core and reduce latency. That supports enterprise applications. And
you had me at cloud native.
And you go, why should I care about that?
The only one thing I'll say just quickly, in a really crude marketing sense to incurious consumers, higher number does work. Yeah. Like, I don't know, if you're going to buy a Hoover or some other electrical appliance and they go, well, this one's 1,500 watts and that other one's only 1,200.
Yeah, but that's just cynical marketing.
And that's the only point I'm making.
But so what is sensing, basically? And there was some just talk about what it is at the dinner, which I thought was a little bit better, I have to say, than the discussion of it at the university event that we went to last year.
Perhaps it's moved on.
Well, the impression I got at the university event last year was that you would need to build out lots of actual sensors and install like miniature chips kind of in.
So like IoT on steroids.
I mean, essentially what it is that you don't need objects to be connected to sense them.
I see.
You could have the technology
goes like radar or something.
The technology goes, exactly. The technology goes into the base station, but as well as the device itself. And it's the base stations and the devices together that could figure out the dimensions of this beer can.
So it can triangulate through all this radiation flying around.
They could look at this beer can, for instance, and work out its dimensions, even what it's made of, apparently.
Right.
And you think, well, why might that be useful? I mean, some of the applications that were being talked about at the dinner were the healthcare one, obviously. If you've got a vulnerable person in a home, they would actually be the object. It can figure out where people are. So if they fall over and are inert, that is something that you could sort of basically transmit a signal to.
So that does make more sense, because I mean, the IoT thing always seemed to rest on there being just a shitload of embedded processors and connectivity and everything.
Yeah, exactly.
Which you thought the logistics and the expense of it makes it infeasible. Yeah. Whereas if the network of the future just senses everything around it, regardless of what it's connected to, then
it's almost like the radio signals become like hands that can sort of feel things out. You know? So another one that got given as an example was if you're driving through a city and you're trying to find somewhere to park, it could direct you to an available parking space and tell you where the location is.
Because it's constantly sensing everything.
Yeah,
I mean there
are some really sinister military applications.
I was going to say, and there is, I've always got my sort of Orwellian, mistrusting any concentration of power type of instincts, and obviously if these networks start to become omniscient, when we think that we're also combining this with AI going through an exponential phase, we are getting a bit. AI was making a joke about HAL. We are getting a bit into that.
Well, the military side of it, I think, and that was the reason for my other piece almost. But one maybe not so sinister military application of it is that apparently on the Ukrainian front lines at the moment, they're putting up, and wouldn't just be in Ukraine, this is something armies want to do generally, is to put up temporary networks for communications that are private. And you see, you put up these,
especially when they're militarily targeting infrastructure.
Yeah, they're sort of things that in a consumer context would be referred to as cows. I think cells on wheels.
Oh, okay,
it gets the acronyms cows. But you'd have like ruggedized stuff for the military that's smaller, and it includes a core network, say, as well. And you can put.
Yeah, I think we've written about that in the past.
And apparently, what you could do with sensing in the future is figure out very, very quickly where is the optimum place to put it, because you might have trees that get in the way. That mean you don't have a good signal in areas where you might need it, but because of this sensing ability, you can sort of work out the best terrain to put the equipment. A more sinister example would be things like precision strikes on targets, but which I think.
Well, and that's a more sinister example when you come to like civilian surveillance.
Yeah.
If you have got
Yeah,
these
monitoring
networks
people.
that can just monitor everything all the
totally.
time,
Yeah, and that's why I
combined
found,
with facial recognition and shit like that.
yeah, this is why I found it interesting that the group that they're involved in on the Etsy side. So Alan's obviously head of this European lab research work, and the ISG, it's called, I think Etsy has these ISGs, doesn't it? Independent Standards Groups. There's one that they've kicked off last November on. You guys wrote about it actually. Andrew wrote a story on it when it happened in
Right.
November on integrated sensing and communications, which is what this
Okay.
is. The three commercial companies that are involved in that are Apple, and apparently Apple's heavily involved for privacy reasons because of what you've just said. There's all sorts of concerns about
Yes.
the privacy side of this.
And actually, Apple's quite good on privacy.
Yeah.
I've got credit where it's due.
Tim Cook always says we're all about this.
Yeah,
Yeah.
He deflects even questions. Well, we're all about. That's not what I asked. Yeah, but we're all about privacy.
Right. He really labours the point.
Yeah.
So InterDigital is one of the other ones. Obviously, it's why they're talking about it. And the other one is Huawei,
Uh-huh.
which is interesting because obviously Huawei is like persona non grata in a lot of Europe at the moment. They've been booted out
among
there,
the US and
but
its
there's
allies.
not been this pushback. You know, we've had these discussions about could it lead to standards bifurcation
Yeah.
and all this, but it's not happened. Like I think,
No, well, I think that's a point you and I often make on the pod. It's all very well demonising them, but you can't just fucking cut them off entirely.
well, so the question I asked the question, you know, isn't it a bit dodgy to have Huawei involved in like a European, technology development when it's as critical as this and could have military uses?
Yeah.
And you know, is the growing concern with 6G about standards fragmentation?
Nice, awkward question.
So, I mean, but I didn't really expect a different response from the one that I got, which is very much just what you said. You can't shut them out. You know, they're an
Yeah.
important player. It's a global standard, blah, blah, blah. But
Yeah, go on, sorry.
2 years ago, you know, I spoke to Ericsson's CEO about this, and he was very concerned about it at the time, about the possibility of the standard fragmenting, and other people clearly are as
No,
well.
I remember him making public
So,
statements.
Obviously, the industry, because InterDigital makes its money the way it does from a global standard, and so does Nokia and so does Ericsson, and they've grown up with that system, and it suits them very much commercially, and it plays into economies of scale, and it leads to convenience for consumers. They're obviously going to push back against this idea of a fragmented standard. And I think one of the things that Ecom was saying 2 years ago was that if it does split into like two systems, we really then need to worry about China actually racing ahead because it's so big. It has so many people, it has so many resources that it could be left behind. Actually,
and they don't have the restrictions on state subsidy. Like
Yeah.
you look at the EU. You know, I subscribe to EU's sort of PR mailing list, and nearly all the time it's like the EU approves Czech Republic chucking a few quid at its farmers or whatever.
Yeah.
Every bit of state subsidy has to be approved. Whereas in China, they'll just go for it, won't they?
Completely, yeah. But and obviously nobody else has actually gone, except for me, I think, in my story. Oh, it's an absolute nightmare that Huawei is involved in this Etsy group. You know, what are we going to do about it?
Right.
But
That's your second story, yeah?
that was actually the
Huawei
first
role
one.
in European 6G network risks new China-US clash.
I just think this whole issue has not really received a lot of attention. I think there was something that happened under Trump in the early days that risked making it a bit hard for US groups to go and work alongside Huawei in standards development, and then the US very quickly, the people in the US who are sort of knowledgeable about this stuff very quickly realised that would be a huge setback for the US and that they could potentially lose out.
Yeah.
You know, and we need to get
Actually,
on.
this
with it.
feeds into one of my more
Yeah.
we'll come up in the chip one. This feeds into one of my
And I
contributions
think
to Chip Chat.
underpinning this as well is this sense of, and you read about this in the press all the time, actually, which shows this is an issue, is this concern that the Chinese, what I was saying earlier, they weren't really anywhere in 3G or 4G, but there's this perception now, perhaps because they talk about things like polar codes a lot, and some of the other underpinning technologies in 5G, that they control the 5G standard.
Yeah.
This is clearly what they're trying to do when they put out these bits of research saying we own most of the patents and we're the guys who developed this. Does the West need to worry if the big players in mobile standards development, when that standard is a global one, are Chinese and they can shape it in a way that suits them, and they can make money from device sales that might be equipment manufactured by Western companies?
You look at broader geopolitical things. Like, this is going to seem like a reach, but there is some coherence to the tangent. For example, nuclear weapons proliferation. Why do countries like Iran really want to have nuclear weapons, other than for the obvious reasons? One of the biggest reasons they want it is because it gets them a seat at the top table.
Yeah.
And no one who hasn't got nukes is sat at that top table. Similarly, with these patents and the R&D and all that sort of thing, you know, US has been victimizing Huawei, whether it's justified or not is another discussion. But if Huawei's got enough control over the technology that everyone needs, they can go, well, do you really want to fucking go there?
Yeah.
Yeah.
And the other thing is, I think an acknowledgement that the US has tried to not only cultivate its own technology developers on the mobile side. I mean, this is where ORAN comes in to some extent, I think.
Yeah.
But actually have people playing a bigger role in the development of the standards themselves. Now, InterDigital is one of those companies, but as I say, it's very small compared with an Ericsson or a Nokia. And another question I asked Alan on the night was, if you look at the top 10 companies in 5G patents at the moment, like, I know these analysts disagree with each other, but let's take a sort of average of them all and look at the top 10 companies. Do you expect when we go to 6G to be a big shake-up, like new people emerge perhaps, or the positions change? And his answer was no. He doesn't, I mean, he was basing this apparently on some other third-party research that's coming out, but his underlying reason was that these same companies that are behind 5G are the ones putting most of the money into 6G development.
Well, it stands to reason.
It's not like someone's coming from nowhere trying to... So we still have to worry about, for the West, the message for the West, though, the guys in the US who get worked up about this sort of thing, the hawks, is that you've still got the prospect of a Huawei and a ZTE being massive power brokers in 6G.
And you've got to contend with that. And, you know, I mean, one of the things I really like about telecoms, when you were talking earlier about, you know, the 3GPP and ETSI and all these standards bodies and the amount of moving parts that have to work in some degree of harmony with each other, all the patents, the FRAND and all that, in order for telecoms to work, is something that I really like. It's just like, it brings out the sort of hippy-dippy, why can't we all just get along side of me? Because in telecoms, we all just make ourselves get along. And that's not to say that we're not adversarial for various reasons, be they commercial, be they geopolitical, whatever, or cultural. But it's in everyone's common interest to just make this fucking thing work.
Well, I think if the standards do split, and I think it probably won't get to that point, actually.
No,
because
there'll be a lot of brinkmanship.
Well, I think if it gets to that point, though, that it's almost the final straw, isn't it, really? If we get to a world where even the actual underlying standards themselves are done on a two-tier system, then we aren't going to be trading with China anymore at all.
No.
It really is like, it's almost like having two planets.
And everyone will be impoverished as a consequence. That's what really annoys me about it. It's just so that a few politicians can have a pissing competition. Everyone's got to be skinter as a result.
Yeah. Anyway, my headline was a bit provocative because I think it's an issue.
Yeah.
It's not something I'm saying I necessarily want to happen, but I bet you the presence of Huawei in this ETSI group that's doing something as critical as sensing is, it's something that's going to alarm politicians for sure.
Yeah, I think you make a good point. I mean, it's only provocative in so much as that you chose as an analytical journalist to go, hold on a sec, there's something going on here.
Yeah.
And, and those are the things that are...
Out of order.
You what?
It's out of order.
Yeah. You're out of order. But, that's the journalist's job. That's what always makes me laugh sometimes when people's feathers get ruffled.
Yeah.
I mean, within reason, it's your job as a journalist to ruffle feathers, not necessarily to be gratuitously antagonistic, but, you can tell. I mean, there's a phrase they use in the States where the flak gets heavier the closer you get to the target.
Yeah, I've been called cynical quite a lot recently by multiple people.
Really?
Yeah, and I said to one of them...
You've got to qualify that. What does that mean?
Well, I said I'm not cynical. I'm hopefully always sceptical,
That means...
possibly critical and never cynical.
So, but yeah,
which is what any journalist should be, I think.
You're a realist.
Yeah, well, so cynical is such a disingenuous pejorative because what they're basically saying is you're not credulous.
Yeah.
You don't just believe any old shit that we tell you, and that makes you cynical.
Yeah.
I've got more on that. I've been having a pop at a few people trying to sell us a load of shit this week.
Right.
Well, actually, that's...
Is it computer technology that actually works? And managed to get in with your password?
Yeah, I'll put you onto them. I will move it on just because, these are all things you wrote about and we've covered them and I don't have anything active to contribute other than my usual gobshitery, which now that I'm on this big tin of 6.5% is ramping quite nicely.
Is there another beer that's like...
Have you just done that 8% one?
Yeah.
Oh,
because I was thirsty. But I don't want another 8% one.
No. We've got,
I don't think there's anything lower.
we've got something that's a mere 7.4%, something that's a mere 7.3%, or we've got this one. Oh, this might do you. This is one of. Oh, this is 7%.
I should have come in today and bought some proper beer. I didn't realise we were.
Well, I just thought, because we've got this surplus of beers, but basically we've got 2 lots of beers. I think you should have this.
They have to go at some
So
point.
this is like having 4 pints, basically.
No, well, that's 7%. That's 7%.
Well,
That's one of Charlie's. This is called
Right.
Odell Brewing Company
Maybe
India
you're
Pale
right.
Ale.
Yeah.
It looks like a chocolate milkshake.
That's just because it's got a brown tin. And put it in the little sheath.
Oh yeah, sorry.
They have to
Although
go-
that only covers about half of it with these big ones that he brought.
You guys have to drink them at some point.
Well, exactly. That was my thinking. Is I knew we had them all sitting here, and we just keep dodging them like the elephant in the room. So I thought, let's have a go at them, especially as we haven't got a guest, so we haven't got to worry about offending someone. Anyway, so I'm going to move it on from there. But there's a slight little segue because we're talking about this America versus China thing and what's going on there. And I wrote a piece this week. I've written quite a lot of just sort of quite tangential analytical pieces because there hasn't been that much news. All the obvious stuff has been.
Sorry.
Have you just had an update on your computer?
No, I can't get into my phone email now.
Oh fuck! Why
It's
are you
probably
trying
because of fucking around with passwords
shit.
upstairs.
Well, just don't think about it for another hour, and then we'll get back on it.
Yeah.
Don't worry. By the time people listen to this, it'll all been sorted. And yeah, so I was writing a few bits where I was just being a bit more creative and just stitching a few bits together in a narrative that occurred to me in the few hours that I give myself to write it. And one of them was headlined, "The cracks in America's China chip strategy are widening." And the subhead was China's semiconductor. Oh shit! I've got a whole word missing from my subhead that I've only just spotted. China's semiconductor seems to be booming. It's supposed to be China's semiconductor industry seems to be booming, despite increasing. I'm gonna sack Andrew for not spotting that. Despite increasing US move to suppress it. I know. Remind me at the end of this. I'll correct that. Not that anyone's reading this now. Anyway, and it's based largely on looking at ASML's quarterlies and yearlies, because everyone's doing their Q4 23 ones right now, so we're getting yearlies as well. And ASML, just to remind listeners, we've spoken about them plenty of times on the pod before, but they have basically cornered the market in a type of ultraviolet lithography, which is basically the only technique you can have for the most cutting edge, like 5 nanometer, 3 nanometer, 2 nanometer manufacturing process for chips. In other words, if you want to make the most advanced chips, you've got to buy shit off ASML. And last year, and the US has been trying to, and they're a Dutch company. The US has been trying to lean on Holland just to go, look, can you cut off the Chinese and help us out with our whatever it is, whatever our strategy is. And the Dutch have gone, well, we'll think about it a little bit. And they've sort of dodged it, and because ASML is like a national champion, I mean, I think they're like one of the biggest up there with SAP as one of the biggest tech companies in Europe.
I think they are Europe's biggest tech company by market cap.
Right. Well, that's amazing, isn't it?
There's a very good piece on them in The Economist, actually.
Okay.
Although I did feel that I'd written a lot of stuff that The Economist wrote before. But
Do you reckon they ripped you off?
No, I'm not saying that. But and it was good, it was well put together as well. And but it was about basically how like Europe now has a kind of tech champion to rival the US ones with ASML.
Well, learning about ASML reminded me a little bit of how when I learnt about ARM about 15 years ago.
Yeah.
And I was like, fucking hell, there's a company that the whole of the mobile and embedded chip world is reliant on, and it's English.
Yeah. Well, and it also actually it's a story because there's a really good book which I'm sure I've mentioned about a dozen times on the podcast by Chris Miller called Chip War that talks a lot about both ARM and ASML.
Yeah,
I mean it's basically a history of the chip industry, but they both come into it. And actually, the origins of the two. The thing about reading that book, because we always ask the question, how do these monopolies exist? How is it that a lot of it's just completely accidental.
Yeah.
Like ARM's presence in smartphones is almost come about by accident. And
Yeah, because it was a little niche.
It was interesting, and it just ended up.
Apple was involved in the start of
Apple
one, wasn't it?
And Apple was actually, I think, has had something to do with it's not so much on ASML. ASML's like TSMC, and it spun off from Philips originally.
Okay,
but
that
had a
makes
lot of
sense.
backing from
Dutch guys.
from Philips, and even Intel's been involved to some extent, I think, in the early days of ASML. But yeah, Apple very much involved in ARM. And
Yep.
But the thing that you take out of Chris Muller's really good book, by the way, very readable as well. Like there's a lot of personalities in it. It's the the characters who are behind it.
It's not just a geek fest.
Is that it's almost accidental, you know.
Yeah.
It's like it didn't really sort of set out this way, but they've ended up cornering these markets.
They didn't know that in 2024 that everyone was going to be dependent on EUV.
Well, you make a bet on something, and all of a sudden it turns out to be the thing you need to make 2 nanometer.
So now they're
they're
an incredibly powerful company. You know, less because they're doing well commercially, but because everyone needs them. Just like you often hear like Americans wargaming, what if China invaded Taiwan? And the only reason America seems to care, I mean, they pretend to care about Taiwan itself, and maybe they do a bit. I mean, my understanding is that they were involved in the formation of Taiwan after the Chinese Civil War.
I think they care about the concept of.
But the main stated reason that I hear on like podcasts and the internet when I'm reading about it is they're shitting about TSMC.
Yeah.
And so TSMC, is the leading chip fab in the whole world. Especially for independence.
They've always had claims on it, even before TSMC became the big deal that it is today. I think even going back to you go back to the 90s and there was saber rattling about...
Yeah. Well, because China's obviously always insisted it's part of China.
And back in those days, TSMC is not even that old, actually. It was, what's his name, set it up, didn't they? I can't remember his name now.
Geezer's still alive, so it's not that old.
He was in America working for, chip companies there, and then went back to Taiwan. He's lured back to Taiwan.
Right.
This story's in Chip War, if anybody's really interested.
Yeah. No, it does sound like fascinating, but it's a fascinating topic, that's for sure.
But now, I think the interesting thing about TSMC being in Taiwan is, I think maybe back in the 90s, you could say, if China does invade Taiwan and the US has given this commitment sort of to protect Taiwan and get involved, why would it really want to necessarily do that? Whereas now maybe there's a reason to do it in terms of safeguarding TSMC.
Well, quite. So that's my point. It might have had a more sort of general, as Pierre was alluding to, a more general, we want to protect this sort of plucky little island nation from being menaced by its big neighbour.
Could they get all the engineers out in time?
Well, it's not just the engineers, it's the plants and stuff.
But whoever built them, I don't know.
I think, this kind of feeds back into the story I wrote. This kind of feeds back into the story I wrote, because it's really not straightforward to try and set up, to try and replicate that sort of stuff. It's incredibly expensive, but also time consuming.
Although I don't think it would be as calamitous as everybody makes out it to be, the sort of disappearance of TSMC from... we'd have to go back down a couple of generations, let's say. But it's not like Intel's setting up foundries where they're aiming to do this stuff and can do pretty advanced stuff at the moment. Like, you're not that much worse off to go to a smartphone that's using 10 nanometer, whatever it is, technology, or certainly in base station equipment. You only have to go back a few years. And I mean, Nokia's been talking about these 5 nanometer chips that are in some of its latest base stations, but they weren't on that until fairly recently, and I don't even know if that's in production networks now. So I don't think it would be as... They obviously have a massive market share, and it would cause disruption from a supply perspective, but I don't think it's the technological edge that matters so much in terms of what they do.
I think it's an easy thing for people to get their head around when they're playing little geopolitical war games, as lots of people like to do. I mean, like, we've had this ridiculous shit going on. Was it this week? Some bloke from the UK going, our young people have got to get better at fighting because we're about to have fucking World War III or something.
Well, I think NATO came out with some warning recently about to prepare for war with Russia in the next 20 years.
Do you know what I mean?
The US, there's a big article in the Telegraph last weekend that my dad was looking at when I met him. It's like about the US moving nuclear weapons to the UK again.
Yeah, and we've had a couple of senior army or armed forces people in the UK going, our young people aren't ready for war. And I was like, well, yeah, there's a good fucking reason for that.
I think it'll be quick. Young people will get to the front line. There will be no front line to go to.
No.
Anyway,
Actually, wait. Sorry.
Yeah, go on.
I saw this video of this guy. He's a journalist, a YouTuber, Johnny Harris. He made a video about chips that end up in Russian missiles in Ukraine.
Yeah.
I mean, it's crazy. All the shell companies they use, all these American chips, gets
Well,
sold to
actually-
like Singapore, Turkey, then sold to another shell company, hop, and then it ends up in the.
Well, this
FSB.
is in a less sort of sinister way. This is the kind of thing I think that's been going on with Huawei for
You
a
can't
long
control
time.
where it goes.
Yeah, like people finding it's the loopholes, and
Well,
the guys that are selling like Nvidia and ASML wanting to sell to China. They don't think about things in geopolitical terms. They just want to make money.
And they're making so much
Yeah,
money.
well-
Well, they're making money like selling to Russia. Like you're selling basically chips so that it ends up in the mall, in the building. They're like, yeah, but I'm making money. I don't care.
This is the funny thing. You get on an ASML earnings call, and the questions that get asked, they're not, should you be selling technology to China because it could empower China militarily? They're, how do you
much
get,
fucking money you make?
how much money can you make in China in the next few years, given US sanctions? You know,
Well,
it's-
and to the
It's like
point.
the what's it called, the prohibition. They're like, okay, now it's prohibition. Let's make
So
money.
this is exactly the point I was just about to make. To the point you two are making, when you restrict something, you just reduce supply and increase demand.
Guacamole.
In other words, you make it more profitable to do it. Just like making drugs illegal. I think all drugs should be legal, and a big part of the reason, apart from a pure libertarian reason, is that then they're not black market.
yeah.
Then you go down the drug shop and buy a pack of 20 fucking Charlies.
It seems to be happening already around Wandsworth. It stinks of skunk everywhere at the moment. It really does.
Oh, that's not the same though.
No. Well, but the problem is skunk. I mean, the reason skunk's called that is because it stinks.
It does smell like some wild animal has pissed everywhere.
Anyway, the bringing the tangent back, a lot of where that tangent went is actually consistent with this story, so it's quite good. So just before we move on to broader stuff, I just want to complete the ASML angle, which is, for all America's attempts to clamp them down, ASML's year-on-year comparisons in 2022. 14% of their net system sales. So they basically have two main sources of revenue. They have net system sales, and then they have like maintenance.
Right.
Going in and about a quarter of their stuff is maintenance. About 3/4 of it is system sales. I think it's about that. Yeah. So in 2022 full year, 14% of their net system sales were to China. ASML. This is 2023 when all these restrictions are supposed to be happening. 29%, more than double
Unbelievable.
the
That's a good
proportion.
angle for a story. Yeah.
Yeah, well, that's why I went there. And there's a couple of other
Has it
ones
doubled it as a proportion.
as a proportion of all their sales went up by 50%.
Right.
So basically, nearly all of the rise in their sales can be accounted for by
It was
China.
the same thing with the Russian chips. This Kyrgyzstan like port, whatever. No, it's landlocked, but whatever. This Kyrgyzstan like shipping lane went up like 900%.
Yeah,
I was like, oh really?
I know. Well, so I mean, this is the point that all three of us have been making. It's one thing to say I'm banning this; it's another thing to actually execute it.
Yeah.
And deal with the unintended consequences, which are nearly always there, which which plays into my libertarian stuff. One of the reasons to be libertarian is that's the natural way of things. The more you try and force people against their nature, the more you get A, resistance, and you have to use violence in order to do it, and B, unintended consequences. And there's just a couple of other points that I made. So yeah, their net system sales were up 42% year on year, and especially tools for logic. So they've got two types of systems, logic and memory.
Yep.
So memory is like DRAM and all that. We don't really care about that. That's not considered so mission critical. Logic is processors. Basically, nearly all their growth was logic, and nearly all of that was logic in China. In other words, ASML has had a great year helping China make CPUs, which is exactly what America wants them to stop doing. Now, one interesting thing, though, is ASML came out with its 2024 outlook, and it said it reckons sales are going to be flat.
Right.
So it's gone from 42% growth to flat in 1 year.
So he's expecting those sanctions to have
actually kick in.
What were they told? Yeah.
Yeah, so they I mean, they didn't say, they're obviously too discreet on their quarterlies to say that's because they're fucking Yanks.
Yeah.
But can you imagine if they said that? But I mean, I don't see how you go from 42% growth to zero growth without there being some exceptional circumstances. So there's an interesting thing. But to the points we were just making about like black markets and that sort of thing. There was another story. Actually, this was one Pierre shared, and I put this in the story. customs officials in South Korea recently uncovered a major smuggling racket responsible for loads of US-made chips evading the bans and making their way to China. And so I've got a hyperlink to whatever. But the point is, China's getting hold of loads of chips because people are circumventing all their ways. And it turns out that Korea, which stands to reason because they got a border with them.
I wonder what the premium is on that, because obviously, it goes through many middlemen. So how much is the premium?
Well, but there's a thing. I mean, I think China is prepared to just chuck money at this.
No, I'm just saying. What do you
But yeah,
think
I'm sure there is a premium.
3 times?
Oh, I couldn't speculate. I mean, but I don't doubt there will be a significant premium. Couldn't possibly comment. But, they'll make it work. And for China, this is a matter not just of geopolitics, but just national pride. They're just like, fuck you. We're not going to let you push us around. So anyway, and then one last thing from that story.
And sorry, to go back, a lot of stuff goes through Singapore, apparently. Singapore loves to play the middleman in those stuff. I thought it was interesting. I didn't paint them as doing that, but yeah. Well,
I mean, culturally and geopolitically, they very much are in the middle because they're quite westernized. They were a former British colony. And they're very open, like Hong Kong used to be until China shut it back down again. But they are sort of ethnically and probably culturally quite Chinese and other parts of Southeast Asia. So, yeah, they're very much in the middle. And as you say, that would seem like an obvious place if you were going to try and circumvent embargoes and that sort of thing.
Maldives as well. Sorry, I keep remembering this video. A lot of stuff goes through the Maldives, like they all of a sudden, come March 2022, was it? They were like, oh, look at all this, like boats full of chips.
So there's boats full of chips and honeymoon couples.
Yeah,
that's basically what you get there. And then, and then I just made one last point, and then I'm going to throw it to you, Ian, because you've got another chip angle. And maybe this last point is the closest to your chip angle. I said the other main pillar to America's geopolitical semiconductor strategy is to throw huge amounts of taxpayer money. I keep seeing typos when I reread my stuff. I should say at chip makers, but it reads as chip. No, I know we don't. I mean, just to defend me a little bit, I completely self-publish. I mean, Andrew will give it a look, but that's after it's published. And I've become quite good at self-proofing, but obviously not fucking perfect. Anyway. This is embodied in the conveniently acronymed CHIPS Act. The Americans can't come up with an acronym unless it spells something, although that's the definition of an acronym, strictly. But progress has been slow, leading to inevitable calls for even more money to be chucked at the initiative. And this points to, and maybe this is a segue for you, this points to stories like saying that Intel saying that some of this stuff's a bit slow because it's waiting for more public money. TSMC's being bribed to set up fabs, and that's all a bit slow, and not just because of a lack of public money, but also local talent, because it's obviously incredibly highly skilled to do this stuff. So just to summarize, and then I'll hand over to you, and we've got ASML flogging more shit than ever to China in 2023. And even if it's flat and it maintains it at those levels, that's still a quarter of its, or 29% of its stuff going to China.
Yeah.
We've got the smuggling operation happening in Korea and Maldives and God knows where else, and Singapore. And then we've got America finding out that just brute spend, just lobbing money at it, isn't transforming its own chip sector overnight. So yeah, Ian, you had a look at chips from a slightly different perspective.
Yeah, I mean, it's interesting looking at ASML because you take those results alone and you think that everything's hunky-dory and, things are booming in the area that we're in maybe, and far from it. I mean, Intel was out last week, I think, its results, and I didn't want to look at it so much from a kind of headline results perspective, which I understand weren't super great. As actually delve into the bit that relates to the area we're in, which is telecom, and they have these different units now. I mean, most of Intel's money clearly comes from two things. One is PCs, and one is data center servers, essentially. And they lump their AI stuff in with the data center server stuff now as well.
Stands to reason.
And they've already suffered there. They've kind of
because NVIDIA's kicking so much.
I mean, they've always been the dominant player in terms of server CPUs, but they've lost some market share to AMD in recent years, and they're So yeah, two things. One that you just mentioned. One is this like sort of trend towards accelerated computing, using GPUs to do some workloads rather than CPUs. And the main one, of course, is sort of AI training. And that's why the big hyperscalers are spending vast amounts of money on NVIDIA chips at the moment. But that hurts Microsoft by implication, simply because it's a bit of, investments kind of shifted essentially to these GPUs from the CPUs that they would have been building recently. And the other reason is the emergence of ARM as kind of a bigger force in the data center environment than it used to be, with companies like Amazon making its own ARM-based chips. They're called Graviton. I think Microsoft's doing something similar now. And the much smaller but related unit to that that they have that's very relevant to our sector is called Network and Edge, which has only been around for a few years, but had an absolutely disastrous year last year. Really, really bad.
And so this is the chips that we've chatted about loads on the pod, where they're trying to get involved in like Open RAN and that sort of thing?
That's a tiny bit of it.
Oh, okay.
What Network and Edge is, a lot of it's edge, selling chips for edge enterprise applications,
okay, and just edge networking, like
edge
little servers that are near base stations.
Edge networking, and but obviously the network side of it, the telco side of it comes under that, and the cloud RAN side of it comes under that as well, which in the area that we're in, small as it might be for Intel today, and actually small as it will be for Intel in the future, even if it took off, it would still be a pretty small part of what Intel does overall.
Compared to servers and PCs, yeah.
It's a significant thing for our sector. And that unit has not done very well. It's gone from, so this is obviously the cloud RAN bit of it is very small, very, very small. But the overall Network and Edge group, its sales went down by about 30% last year to something like 5.5 billion, I think.
What does that say to you?
And the other thing is that losses. So the operating profit that they report, they were sort of they were making about $1 billion, I think. So this is a sort of 2022 fiscal year. 2023, it's $500 million loss.
This is that's that segment,
that Network and Edge segment,
right?
Yeah. So one thing it says to me is clearly, Cloud RAN is not, Cloud RAN, we know actually from looking at other companies' results and from looking at overall RAN figures that the RAN sector is not in a good position at the moment.
Yeah.
You look at where Ericsson and Nokia are.
We chatted about that last week.
And their sales are down quite significantly. Intel's a part of that, is trying to get into that. Intel actually does sell a lot of purpose-built RAN chips, a lot of the stuff that you'd find in Nokia, Ericsson networks, where you're not doing a cloud thing, actually comes from Intel as well. But that's obviously been impacted by this slowdown. And then the stuff that they're trying to do that is introducing general purpose hardware into the telecom sector has clearly not taken off. Because if it had, you'd assume there'd be some kind of reference to it. There was actually mention, I think, of 5G in the annual report about it's not been a very good year for 5G, and there's been sort of an impact there.
But, so we've got the stuff we spoke about last week and in other pods about just how operators aren't spending that much money, full stop.
Yeah.
But then the angle I wonder around it is something that you've been really all over in the last year or two, which is this, to what extent you can use a general purpose processor to do telecom specific shit, and those numbers seem to imply that it's not so much.
It's not gone anywhere. It's the cloud RAN concept, or virtual RAN, if you like, because it's not really open RAN. Actually, it's like we talk about this all the time, but they're two kind of slightly different things, vRAN and cloud RAN, compared with open RAN. But it's just not really gone anywhere, and this year doesn't look great for it either, I don't think. I think companies are really wary of doing this, until they really see the benefits of it. And I remember speaking to Mark Henry, actually, who's the head of network strategy for BT. So he used to work for Neil McRae, who we've had on the podcast a few times. Neil's obviously now at Juniper.
I've got him lined up for another one in the future.
Neil
McRae,
or Mark. Okay, well, Mark would be good to get on as well.
We'll chat about that.
But I chatted to him at an event that we were both at called Network X last sort of October, November time.
Yeah.
And he said, we're not going to do Cloud RAN unless we actually see the benefits of doing it, and at the moment we're kind of questioning this because unless there really is an obvious sort of operational cost benefit or there's something significant that you can see that feeds through into end performance, end results, making things easier to run, then they're not just going to do it because Intel says we want to sell more general purpose processors.
Isn't this what you and I have been saying for years, which is it's great on paper, and vendor plurality is a great concept, again, on paper. But, you can't just go, this will be as good as Ericsson or Nokia. Yeah. It's got to be better. Otherwise, if it ain't broke, don't fix it.
Well, and this is the problem they have, is that you do hear this argument from people who are really supportive of Cloud RAN and virtual RAN. Actually, on the telco side as well, you hear some voices saying this, that we see a roadmap to where the point where general purpose processors, the Xeon family of stuff that Intel's doing, Sapphire Rapids and Granite Rapids beyond that, will outperform, these system on chips and application specific integrated circuits that the likes of Ericsson and Nokia do. But Ericsson clearly doesn't believe that itself, even though it's all in with Intel on its Cloud RAN strategy. I did an article a few weeks ago on this where the guys that kind of look after that side of things clearly, and it stands to reason, doesn't it? If you're doing a chip for a specific thing, and it's also completely at odds with what's going on in the wider world, this whole business of using accelerated computing to look after specific workloads, bringing in GPUs to look after AI, bringing in a specific type of chip to look after a workload where this is exactly the reason why a company like Nokia has gone down the road with Marvell to do its layer 1 chips,
right?
Rather than, which is a custom chip essentially. They're positioning that as part of their Cloud RAN strategy, but it is a custom bit of silicon, rather than trying to put all of that stuff onto an Intel CPU.
You made that point last week about the different PUs, processing units.
Yeah.
And you get that even within like something like a Snapdragon, which is an SoC, i.e. all the different processing units are on the same bit of silicon, but it's got different zones, and it's got a CPU and a GPU and a digital processing unit and a AI processing unit and all that sort of thing. And just another thing, like this morning, I was noticing my PC, which I realised I bought in 2018, which, like, I know Macs last a bit longer, but that's a good 5-6 years isn't bad for a PC. Yeah. It's starting to creak a little bit.
Yeah.
And so I started looking. I bought it from a company which I recommend because it's given me no trouble in that whole time. A UK company called PC Specialist, and they've got all these little drop downs of you can configure it. You can pick from hundreds of different graphics cards and CPUs and all that.
Yeah.
And it's bewildering. And I just did a little bit of Googling as to what should I go for. Anyway, but the point is, everyone who buys a PC and thinks about it, especially if they do PC gaming, which I do, knows that you want a CPU for most shit, and you want a GPU for gaming.
Yeah, but you do like very high graphics.
Not intense, no. So I don't need to spend tons, but I still want a graphics card. I'm not just going to use the onboard graphics from the Intel chip.
I think the problem for Intel, and this is kind of gets to what we were talking about with Charlie last week, but I couldn't. It's almost easier to talk about it without him being here, because we can be commentators on some of the stuff that's going on.
I'm not talking to someone who's forgotten more than we know about,
and also someone who's involved in it, But from a third-party perspective, and I think this is an issue that analysts have addressed as well, is that Intel's in this awkward position of making most of its money from selling general purpose processors, but also realizing that there's a need for customization.
Yeah.
It's spinning off this FPGA, this programmable computing bit, which involves actually doing more kind of custom stuff.
We talked about a lot last week.
And this is the criticism of them at the moment, is that they're not being completely honest in some ways, not being completely upfront, let's say, not honest, but completely upfront about their Cloud RAN strategy, in the sense that they would say their criticism of someone like Marvell would be, oh, but it's not really what you're doing is not really using general purpose processors. You're actually putting stuff onto custom silicon. But if you look at what Intel's having to do to overcome some of these problems of trying to do radio access network functions on CPUs, they're actually offloading a lot of it themselves. They're increasingly using accelerators.
Yeah.
They're having to use some customization. They're developing these products now which bundle a lot of stuff together and integrate things. And it's actually incredibly customized. It's not really the same stuff that you'd sell to a Walmart to run a server in a building. That it's quite a different thing. So but they don't want to say that because their bread and butter is CPUs.
And then you think about the business model of a company like Intel that has fabs versus a company like Qualcomm that relies on TSMC.
Yeah.
Intel is much more of a manufacturing company, whereas Qualcomm's much more of an IP company. And a manufacturing company, I'm no expert on this, but my understanding is that manufacturing is all about You've already spent all the capex in the plant, in the kit.
Yeah.
And a manufacturing company wants that kit to be working at close to 100% capacity a lot of the time. That's how they optimize their business model. They want to be churning shit out. And then it's a matter of that shit they've churned out, in the case of Intel chips, then finding a fucking place for it, finding some way of flogging it.
Yeah.
So, of course, their business model vested interest is to say you need general purpose chips for fucking everything. You need it for your fridge. You need it for your car. You need it for everything. Because each time a new utility comes up for their product, they get to flog more of this stuff, which they're making anyway. They probably bin loads of this stuff when they don't sell it. Because it probably makes, with manufacturing, it sometimes makes more sense to make it and bin it than to turn off the machines. So yes, that's my way of saying I completely understand where Intel's coming from in steering people in that direction. But I take your point. Sometimes they might take some liberties and oversell it a bit.
And the other things about their network and edge group and prospects for it, and specifically prospects for the Cloud RAN side of it in the next sort of few years. So the big deal that's happened. One thing I'd say just before I get to that, but the whole sort of dispute with companies like Marvell that are using kind of custom silicon very much used to be described as this sort of look aside versus inline contest. And I think, with operators themselves, you've got people like Mark Henry saying we're not sure even of Cloud RAN generally, and you've got companies like Vodafone whose position is we're still looking into the differences between look aside and inline. But I think that whole dispute, first of all, whether Cloud RAN's actually worth doing, and secondly, whether these different options that you have in Cloud RAN, which one looks better, have probably not helped Intel in terms of moving Cloud RAN along. Because as soon as people start to disagree on something, it slows down progress,
Mm-hmm.
And the other thing I'd say is that the big thing that has happened in the last few weeks that might be seen as a positive for Intel is this Ericsson deal with AT&T.
Right.
Which
has got a lot of Open RAN-y elements.
Where Intel was specifically called out in the statements from both AT&T and Ericsson as one of the other vendors that would figure. The implication being, obviously, that there are two ways you can read that. One is that Intel's actually a manufacturing partner of Ericsson. They've said they're going to build a lot of their sort of SoCs in future using Intel.
Yeah. And Intel has been trying to move. Intel 10, 20 years ago used to be only about making its own chips, but it's been trying to move to a more foundry model for a while. Yeah,
that's not so much a foundry. The foundry's more like making chips for other chip makers, isn't it? I think they've always had a role where they've made chips for Ericsson and Nokia.
Oh, okay.
But they've agreed to do this. This advanced sort of based on the what do they call it? It's 2 nanometer chips basically. Anyway, the agreement they had last year.
That's the absolute cutting edge.
But the point of that Ericsson would make is that's purely a sort of manufacturing deal. Really, it's not a kind of Intel coming in and doing what Marvell's doing with Nokia, where they're actually sort of heavily involved in the design of it as well.
Sort of partnership.
But I think the implication with the Intel being called out in the AT&T and the Ericsson statements was that there'd be a big Cloud RAN component to this. That it would be and Dell was named as well. So it's Dell servers with Intel chips running Ericsson software.
And you can just see and it's AT&T, and you can just see the sort of American state smiling benignly and on all these other US stakeholders being involved.
But the point is they're not going to be doing that at first. They've said that themselves. They name it in the original statement, and then you dig in a bit and ask people questions, and it's like, well, actually, at first, what we're doing is Ericsson chips. We're using Ericsson's purpose-built chips. Later, when it advances to the point when we're happy with it, we'll start to use Intel chips and have a Cloud RAN. But at first, you're basically they're building a purpose-built RAN. So this whole network and edge Xeon processors being used for the radio access network is not going to benefit this year from the Ericsson and AT&T deal. It's not going to pick things up for them at all because there won't be any of it deployed
But
this
I can
year.
still see that the cynic in me can see, because the thing is, and this will be something I'm going to bring up in the concluding segment, which will come up in a minute. The US state, when it comes to technology, has like sort of military strategic objectives, but they don't have a fucking clue really. So people like AT&T and Intel and Dell could go to the US state and go, look, we're doing all this shit and we're going to bring more stuff on shore and we're going to marginalize the Chinese and whatever it is they think the politicians and the security state apparat need to hear.
Yeah.
But then in practice, as you've just described, that's just window dressing. That's just geopolitical window dressing, whereas what's actually happening on the ground is less of that.
Yeah. Yeah, totally.
Yeah, I can completely see that. Okay, look, I will move on because, again, I'm practicing.
Can I do the city of the month, actually?
Oh, yeah, go for it, mate.
We wrapped with January. So the city of the month is... Do you want to have a guess?
Johannesburg.
Ulaanbaatar.
It's linked to one of our big guests last year.
Big guess last year?
Is it Boulder?
Dublin.
No.
Yeah, it's Dublin. Then the very close second is Phoenix, Arizona.
Okay, well, that's near-ish to Boulder.
Yeah.
And then Frankfurt.
Okay.
Frankfurt.
Dublin,
okay.
Germany.
Dublin, Phoenix and Frankfurt. That'll do. That's a nice mix, isn't it?
And country podium is UK, US, Ireland. There you go.
Right. So we got quite a lot of Ireland.
Do you know,
Ireland is a
apparently,
distant third, but yes.
But Dublin was in there.
There's some stuff going on about data centers, energy consumption in the press this week. Because I approved of it, the general gist of the coverage, because it was basically saying all this stuff about AI being, everybody goes on about, let's use AI more because we can
It's
be
incredibly
greener.
energy hungry, isn't it?
It's totally energy, yeah. It's very and one of the reasons is because it uses so much data center
And so much processing. Yeah.
But then they were looking at how much of the overall sort of energy consumption is accounted for by data centers, and it very much varies on a country by country basis, depending on.
When Ireland's right up there.
And Ireland apparently is like something ridiculous. It's like a quarter of the energy in Ireland.
Yeah, because they're like
data centers.
they're a European HQ for most big
are.
tech, aren't they?
Yeah.
Probably because of the tax
It's huge.
regime.
It's like off the scale compared
Yeah.
to most other countries. How much of Ireland's energy bill is just on data centers?
That's why whenever like Europe decides to have a go at Apple or whatever, Ireland's always the one going, hold on a second now. Because they're just like...
I'm a bishop, you little bollock.
Pack it in, you gobshite. Sorry, Ireland, for the cliched Ireland bollocks there. Just because I've watched a couple of episodes of Father Ted, I reckon I can do an Irish
I'm only
accent.
repeating what you said. I haven't never seen it.
You've never seen? Have you never watched Father Ted?
No,
It's so good.
It's really funny.
It's just brilliant. But it does make you want to talk in a sort of hackneyed Irish accent.
I must
when
have
you
seen
listen to
some
it.
clips. Yeah.
Oh, it's brilliant.
Yeah. That was the one you were repeating is Bishop Brennan, where he goes, "Oh, Len," he goes, "I'm a bishop, you little bollocks." They got some great swearing over there. And as you know, I like a bit of swearing. What were we saying? No, I completely get that. Well, let me move it on anyway. I'm going to say, so a couple of stories I wrote this week, apart from that one I just mentioned with the chips, that I think are worth bringing up. Actually, there's a quick one that I just got up on my screen before I forget. We were talking about the overselling of like 4G, 5G, 6G, all that sort of thing. There was a little story this week where Comcast in the US got told to drop a brand. It's got a sub-brand of its Xfinity comms product that it calls 10G. Cheeky fuckers. And their equivalent of the Advertising Standards Authority, it's called a National Advertising Review Board, NARB. They just went, look, just pack it in. It's not 10G. And they were going, well, we say that because we think it's so good. And they're going, look, it's misleading. You're either making people think it's 10G as opposed to 5G, or you're making them think they're getting 10 gigabits per second bandwidth, which they're not getting either. So just shut the fuck up. And so they've been forced to do it. Anyway, that's a little aside. What was it? So there was one I wrote today, which I thought was interesting, which kind of picks on a couple of other ones that I've done towards the end of pods before. So Apple has got forced by Europe through its thing called the Digital Markets Act to to allow other app stores and other payment mechanisms through iOS. This is an ongoing thing. Epic's been going on about it. They're basically saying it's monopolistic that Apple and Android, it must be said, but in this case, Apple, because when you and Pierre use your iPhones, you've got, and you use an app, you're basically in a mini monopoly there, and Apple gets to compel all those apps to send all their commercial activity. Let's say you play a game or you have something that involves some in-app purchases. Apple gets 30% of everything you do subsequently over your phone. So it gets this constant massive tax on everything that goes on. People like Epic, who make Fortnite, have got the arsehole about it. Anyway, Europe's gone, yeah, you've got to allow other app stores and other payment mechanisms. And Apple went, yeah, all right, we'll allow that, and then we'll attach so many other strings to it that it'll be such a ball ache that no one will do it. Right. And that's considered to be very bad faith. And anyway, in the analyst call about Meta's, which is what we used to call Facebook, Meta's numbers, which are mad, by the way. Were we talking about this before we started recording?
Yeah. How?
So not only are their year-on-year great, like their profits up 200% year-on-year. I mean, that's not bad for a massive company.
I mean, they did fire a bunch of people, right?
Well, they did. So they had an idea towards the end of 2022. They had a nightmare. Everyone was thinking that this metaverse strategy is bollocks, and I still think it's bollocks, but maybe...
I don't think that's why their profits are up, or even their sales. Nothing to do with metaverse, is it?
No, I think a lot of it probably is streamlining, just boring corporate efficiencies.
What happens to their revenues, though?
So their revenues year-on-year were only up 25%, and their profits are up 200%. Yeah, but
it cannot be
that's
like
so huge. But for a company of that size, to have
that's still a lot.
It cannot,
but I think they had a bit of a nightmare a year ago.
It cannot be like Threads, whatever they.
Do you know what I mean? No one fucking uses that.
Yeah, where's that money coming from? I don't know.
That's astonishing.
It's a mystery.
I stopped using Facebook like 10 years ago.
Other big tech firms aren't reporting 25% revenue growth, are they?
No, it is astonishing. All I'm saying is you've got to bear in mind they did have an idea a year or so ago.
Yeah.
It's probably the rest of the world. So I have my own silo, and I'm like, I don't use Facebook. I don't know many people who.
Yeah, well, you're probably right.
You might
no
go
one
to
uses
Indonesia,
Facebook.
and there you go. That's
my dad used to.
Yeah,
but it was like his generation.
Well, I don't know.
Do you use it?
You use it.
Hardly.
You were on it.
And I use it less and less frequently compared to 5 years ago as well.
I don't use it a lot, but I've never used it a lot, and I don't use any social media a lot. So,
fair enough.
And I think the other thing is that you might be using it even though you don't know you're using it through Instagram or.
But I don't use Instagram. I don't use Message. I do use WhatsApp, but I don't think they do a good job of monetizing WhatsApp.
No, they don't. No, I don't think WhatsApp's monetized at all.
No, I think there's business WhatsApp. Maybe they take a chunk of that.
But we've got a WhatsApp group called Pod in it.
Yeah.
But there's and they don't make any money when we send each other messages.
No, but if you have your business, you can have a business account, and maybe they take a penny of every transaction or something. I don't know.
Maybe. Anyway, so they're doing all right, but in their quarterlies,
the dividend.
Zuckerberg was asked what he thinks of this Apple thing and the concession they've made, and I'm just going to quote him and I've got to give credit where it's due. I always get my transcriptions of quarterly stuff from Seeking Alpha because they do this great thing where they just publish the whole fucking thing transcribed.
Yeah, if you can get into it, sometimes you can't.
Yeah, you got to have an account.
Yeah, sometimes you can't get in.
All right, a bit like your computer.
Yeah.
Don't worry, just keep eating that Yank chocolate. That'll make you feel better. Anyway, and this is a quote from Zuck in answer to that question. Quote, I don't think the Apple thing is going to have any difference for us because I think the way they've implemented it, I'd be very surprised if any developer chose to go into the alternative app stores they have. They've made it so onerous and I think so at odds with the intent of what the EU regulation was that I think it's just going to be very difficult for anyone, including ourselves, to really seriously entertain what they're doing there. So that's what I led with. My headline was Meta Zuckerberg denounces Apple App Store move as onerous. And I'm just pleased. I mean, I know they've all got a vested interest. Epic, Spotify, Meta, they've all got a vested interest in paying Apple less money for using the App Store. But that doesn't mean they're wrong. And in this case, as I said before, and I'm not going to labour it now, I do think Apple is monopolistic. It's a natural monopoly. It's not through M&A. It's through merit. I mean, Apple's got a monopoly because it makes devices that everyone fucking wants. So fair play. I'm not saying they don't deserve the monopoly, but it's still a monopoly. And it still needs to be regulated accordingly. You know, and this is coming from someone who's like laissez-faire to the cliche. It's when I get to use my French, Pierre.
Libertarian.
What's French for laissez-faire?
We don't have a word for it.
We don't have a word for it. What's German for laughing at other people's misfortune? And so that I thought that was an interesting one. But then another one, which is a complete tangent, is they had these hearings in the US, these Senate hearings into the role social media plays in, let's keep it top line, child abuse. And, you know, whether or not they're doing enough to protect kids. So it's a bit sort of adjacent to like the online Safety Act that we've got in the UK. There's a hell of a lot of political will to clamp down on big tech, on social media companies in the name of protecting children. Now, superficially, obviously, what's the fucking complaint about there? And if even one kid ends up getting exploited or damaged or killed, which is the allegation here, as a direct result of their participation in social media, then that obviously needs addressing. But I seriously question the motives and the tactics of politicians and the way they go about it. And I think they're using it as a battering ram just to impose their will on big tech for political censorship. They basically want, ever since the 2016 elections...
Get more funding.
Yeah, maybe that as well. But I think get concessions from them by... The more they hassle them about this, that and the other, the more they can then negotiate behind the scenes and go, I'll tell you what, we'll turn down the heat a little bit if you meet us halfway on this stuff. Yeah, it's just it's the way the world works. It's just horse trading. And ever since the 2016 elections, the dual electoral shocks of Trump and Brexit in 2016, establishment politics have been shitting themselves. That basically the whole electoral picture is being skewed by social media because there's too many people going off, listening to Joe Rogan, or going down really much worse than Joe Rogan, like crazy rabbit holes on Reddit or whatever. Yeah. And I'm not saying it's unjustified because there are some enclaves of the internet that are probably pretty fucking dark. Mm. But anyway, they want to exercise more control over it. And so when you get these things happening, I think that's what's really going on behind it. And it was just toe curling that these things. So two things happened that are directly related to Zuckerberg. There was one politician called Hawley, I think, who just started hassling him and going, you know, how do you feel about killing kids, sort of thing. It's really blatant. And then he actually made him stand up, turn around and talk to all these parents that he'd conveniently bust in that are holding up pictures of their fucking dead kids, and he made them apologise to them. And it's just so performative and so
But can
cringe.
you force him to do that? He can't be forced to stand up and do that.
He was forced. If you watch the video and the story, he's kind of forced because he's put under the spotlight. He said, are you going to apologise to these people? And then all these mothers with pictures of their dead kids stood up. And what's he going to do? Not apologise. What's he going to do? Go, nah, I'm not going to bother. So the point is...
I mean, there would have been a way of responding to that on his part. But
maybe.
He was probably put on the spot without apologising and without seeming like a dick by not doing so.
Well, I think if you look at the video...
apologising is that you're almost then saying that
You're culpable.
That you're culpable of doing this, and you don't really want to do that because it's like saying Coca-Cola should take responsibility for all the obesity deaths in the world, and you should stand up and apologise to all these people who are...
Or the guy who invented the press for books about Mein Kampf.
Or people who invented printing technology. Well, look at all the glasses people wear these days. You've messed up their eyesight. Are you going to apologise to all these people?
Or telcos for abuse that's doshed out over the phone. I mean, there's all these things. You got to understand, and I'm probably a bit more au fait with it than you. You got to understand these Senate hearings, these congressional hearings they have in the States are always just political theatre. They're so that politicians can grandstand.
I mean, there are some that are justified, like the Boeing, cover-up of their software systems that ended up with a couple of planes crashing, one in Ethiopia, one in the Far East. That was awful. That's clearly negligence on the company's part and like not looking into systems properly. And that guy deserved to have a bunch of people sitting behind him with photos of their relatives. But to say, like, a child's death's a horrible thing, but to just blame it on social media, I think you're making a number of leaps there to sort of get to that point.
And even if you could, I think my bigger point is it's the performative nature of it that really winds me up. Yeah. Even if you could say that.
Well, sometimes people need to have that, like the Boeing thing. I think he deserved to
have a public kicking.
He deserved to have a public kicking, the guy at the time, I think.
Yeah.
Was my feeling.
Doors coming off.
I mean, Zuckerberg's he's not Hitler, They might want to make him out to be that way, but he's not.
And he can obviously point to loads of stuff they are trying to do.
He's a dweeby guy who's turned out to be very successful. Let's be honest.
Well, honestly, Ian, you check it out. The headline. It's the one I put up today. The headline is Zuckerberg's. Meta Zuckerberg denounces Apple App Store move as onerous. So the main bit was the bit I just touched on earlier, and then I went, but go and maybe if we get a pub after, I'll get you to watch it.
Yeah, I'll have a look.
It's fucking awkward, and the point is, maybe it should be awkward, as you say, with Boeing. Maybe it should be awkward, but to me, it just feels
not
like...
in this case, no.
I'll tell you what, here's my concluding paragraph. As you can see in the videos below, Zuck was forced to publicly apologise to families who apparently feel their children died as a direct result of interactions on social media, and generally put up with an appalling degree of bullying and hectoring. These public hearings are usually little more than crude political theatre, but given the subject matter, it's especially disappointing to see political leaders forego the opportunity to make substantial progress in favour of trying to make themselves look tough. And it's the disingenuousness of it.
The problem is also, the disingenuous, but to come back to what he's accused of doing is that people are making leaps. Their kids would have been picked on anyway, or
got hold of drugs or whatever.
Their kids, in 20, 30 years ago, there wouldn't have been someone so easy to blame. It would just have been the other kids who did it. All social media does is amplify that, but it's not. It's a tool.
I think there's some genuine
one. Like social media's done it to them.
I think if you could find a paper trail that proves, for example, a grooming process. That happened through social media, then you're going, okay, all right, there's something a bit more substantial.
Or if you could genuinely prove that Facebook knew about live streaming of terrorist atrocities going on and didn't do anything about it when it could have done, that's very different.
Yes.
Than just using social media to be nasty to people and then they end up like doing something horrible to themselves, which is awful. I'm not saying it isn't, but to blame Zuckerberg for that, I think is a real leap. I understand why families might want to do it, because maybe I would in the same situation. But
I don't blame the mums for turning up with pictures of their kids.
These wanker politicians doing that is just incredibly cynical.
It's the politicians that I'm annoyed at.
Yeah.
And kind of using these bereaved families as political tools. Yeah. That's what I don't like.
Said, are you going to stand up to these families who lost kids because of the bombings you authorized?
Yeah, well, quite. If we're going to get into morality.
Yeah.
But anyway, and then I'll quickly finish off. There was just one other one where I'm just calling bullshit on some of this stuff, which was Deutsche Telekom this week. They sent a press release where they've launched a campaign called #AgainstHateSpeech. Now, so there's just on its surface, before I drill down a little bit, there's two things I dislike about that. First is just the superficiality of the campaign. I mean, what is it for Deutsche Telekom to do this one way or the other? And secondly, hate speech I've said this before, is a term that I hate because it's so ill-defined. What's hate speech?
Yeah.
Basically, it's on the person. It's on the person who gets to define it. They have all the power.
Totally, yeah.
I could say your fucking top is hate speech.
Yeah, exactly.
In fact, normally people would argue with me in this particular case.
Well, I wore it for him.
And anyway, and then sort of drilling down, they actually had another campaign a few years ago, which was called An Internet Free from Hate. Again, this word hate that is not defined.
A world free from hate.
Can you hate pistachio ice cream? Is that allowed?
I don't know
anyway.
if it is these days.
No, but okay, I think you're being a bit...
No, I'm being a bit reductio ad absurdum, but the point is, what does hate mean? I mean, it could mean horrible, violent bigotry, or it could mean just hating a certain kind of food. When it's ill-defined, it could mean any of those things.
It doesn't say that it's specifically to people.
No, they just say hate. We just don't want hate. Hate is bad.
Well,
I think it's implied.
The problem I have...
Well, maybe it's implied.
The food doesn't have feelings.
But that's the problem I have with hate speech, is this implication we can't be nasty to anybody. And actually, we need to be nasty to people sometimes. Yeah. I'm sorry if I upset your feelings occasionally online, but I need to do that to get my point
across. That can't be the primary
your
determinant.
Views are wrong. If you're going to characterise that as hate speech because it made you feel really bad about yourself, tough. Obviously, you don't want bigotry and you don't want someone encouraging someone going around and setting fire to someone's house, but those are outlawed anyway.
Well, quite. And incitement to violence is a specific thing. I think the concept of hate speech is an attempt to broaden the window of what you can censor.
Yeah.
Anyway, and the thing that annoyed me most about this DT thing is it was most demonstrated by the 3 canned quotes they put in. One was from Ulrich Klinker, who's their chief brand officer. One was from Melanie Kubin-Hardewig, who's their head of corporate responsibility, and one was from Christian Hahn, who's their head of strategy, marketing, communication, and media. In other words, 2 marketing people and 1 CSR person. This is all about their marketing.
Yeah.
They don't actually give a fuck. I mean, I'll take it back a little bit because I'll read my concluding paragraph, but this is what annoys me. It's the disingenuousness, again, like talking back to those US senators. They claim to be making a moral position, but this is just a marketing campaign. And it's just that they're using this moral position as a marketing tool because they think that more people will buy their shit if they think they're a nice, fluffy company that cares about good stuff and doesn't like bad stuff.
Yeah.
But I just think it's insincere. And I'll read my concluding paragraph, and then if you've got any final comment, make it, and then we'll wrap it up. My concluding paragraph is that. And bear in mind, they've got a whole big TV campaign, and they were mentioning all these ad agencies like Saatchi and all that stuff involved. I said, we have no reason, I always write in the third person rather than first person. We have no reason to doubt that most, if not all, DT employees long for a more pleasant public conversational environment, and so do we. I mean, no one's in favour of people being dicks to each other. And of course, aggressive bigotry should be challenged, which again, I agree with. As you were just saying, if someone's calling for out of order behaviour, then that should be challenged. But then I concluded, I said, but it's conceptually very difficult to attribute a moral position to any organisation, let alone a commercial one. This is further complicated when their every supposedly altruistic act is accompanied by press releases and expensive branding campaigns. And that's my ultimate point. By all means, do the good thing. But then if you're looking to make marketing capital out of it, to me, it completely diminishes the good gesture. And seeing as you already said in advance you've got nothing more to say, I'll wrap it up there. Pierre, you got to go off and get pissed for your birthday. Or maybe you don't do that.
I'll be responsible.
You'll be responsible. And hopefully we've got a guest next week if they're not ill. So thanks for listening, and make sure you join us for that one.